Who do you think you are questioning me like that? The older man barked, his voice sharp and indignant. I didn't flinch, keeping my gaze steady as I replied. Mr. Nguyen, I said, my tone measured. I'm here to help you, but if you want my help, I need the whole picture, every detail. He exhaled sharply, his pride clearly bruised, but he didn't argue further. For a moment he looked away, shaking his head. My name is Danielle, which is the name I chose for myself when I was a kid. I'm a 30-year-old attorney. I never carried my family last name. I created my own. I built my career on resilience, channeling the pain of my past into a drive to succeed. When I was 6 years old, my parents abandoned me at an orphanage, leaving me to piece together a life without them. They walked away without a second glance, leaving me to wonder what I had done wrong, why I wasn't enough. Now, decades later, the very people who discarded me are sitting in my office, begging for legal counsel, and they have no idea who I am. I was 6 years old the last time I saw them. My mom had dressed me in my nicest outfit that morning, a yellow dress with little white daisies, and told me we were going somewhere special. I remember holding her hand tightly as we walked into the orphanage, the bright sunlight outside contrasting with the dimly lit hallways inside. The air smelled of cleaning supplies and something else I couldn't place, something cold, like emptiness. She knelt down in front of me, brushing a strand of hair from my face. You'll love it here, she said, her voice soft but hollow. They'll take such good care of you. I didn't understand what she meant. When are you coming back? I asked, my small hands clutching hers. She hesitated, her eyes darting away before she forced a smile. Soon, sweetheart. Be good, okay? I didn't cry as she walked away. I just stood there, staring at the door, waiting for it to swing open again. But it didn't. Hours passed, and then days, before I realized she wasn't coming back. That was the day I learned what it meant to be alone. The orphanage became my world, a place where I quickly learned that survival meant toughness. I stopped asking why my parents didn't come back. The other kids didn't want to hear it, and the caretakers didn't have answers. Instead, I focused on what I could control, my studies. Books became my escape, a place where I could lose myself in stories far from the sterile walls of the orphanage. I promised myself I'd be better, smarter, stronger than anyone who thought I wasn't worth keeping. But the nights were the hardest. Alone in my bunk, I'd stare at the ceiling, wondering what I had done to make them leave me. Did I cry too much? Was I not helpful enough? Every question became a fuel for the fire inside me, a fire that burned to prove, even if only to myself, that I was enough. I would show them. Somehow, some way, I would show the world that I wasn't the useless girl they thought I was. It wasn't until years later that I learned the truth about why they left me there. The orphanage director, a kind but overworked woman named Mrs. Patel, had pulled me aside when I was about 10. She'd been there the day my parents dropped me off, and she'd always seemed to feel sorry for me in a way I didn't fully understand. Danielle, she said gently, sitting me down in her small, cluttered office. You're old enough now to know why your parents brought you here. Her voice was kind, but her words hit like a knife. Your parents. They came from a very traditional background. When your little brother was born, they believed it was their duty to focus all their attention and resources on him, as the family's heir. I stared at her, the words sinking in like stones. But I'm their daughter, I said, my voice trembling. Why didn't they want me too? Mrs. Patel sighed, her eyes filled with sympathy. It's not about what you did or didn't do, Danielle. It's about them and their beliefs. It's wrong, so very wrong. But they thought they were doing what was expected of them. That night, as I lay in bed, the reality of their rejection hit me in full force. They hadn't left me because of anything I did. They left me because of who I was, a girl who to them wasn't worth keeping. After that conversation, something in me shifted. I stopped asking why they left and started focusing on what I could do to move forward. The rejection that once crushed me became my fuel. At school, I threw myself into every subject, determined to be the best. I stayed late to read in the library, poring over books that stretched my imagination and taught me about a world far bigger than the orphanage. By the time I was 16, I was winning academic competitions and earning recognition from teachers who saw my potential. Danielle, one of them, told me, "You could go far. You just need the right opportunities." Those words planted a seed of hope in me. I started applying for scholarships with a single goal in mind: to get into a good university and prove to myself that I could rise above the circumstances I was born into. When the acceptance letter from a prestigious school came in the mail, I held it in my hands like it was a golden ticket. It wasn't just a chance to study, it was my way out. The orphanage threw a small party in my honor, and Mrs. Patel, who had always been my quiet supporter, hugged me tightly. "You've earned this, Danielle," she said. "Now go show the world what you can do." College was a whirlwind. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who believed in me, or at least respected what I brought to the table. My professors noticed my drive, and my peers were drawn to my focus and determination. I took every opportunity that came my way: internships, leadership roles, and study groups that pushed me to the limit. Law school followed, and while it was grueling, I thrived on the challenge. I learned to channel my emotions into my work, using my own story to connect with the cases I studied. I knew what it was like to feel powerless, and I wanted to make sure others didn't have to feel the same. By the time I graduated, I had offers from some of the best firms in the country. I chose a firm in New York that specialized in helping underserved communities, a place where I could make a difference while building my career. Through it all, I kept my past a secret. It wasn't out of shame. I had nothing to be ashamed of, but because I wanted people to see me for who I was now, not the girl who had been left behind. Every step I took felt like a victory, a reminder that I had become someone my younger self could be proud of. It was during my second year at the firm that I met Mark. He was one of the attorneys on a joint case we worked, a complicated mess involving housing rights. At first, he was just another name in a sea of professionals, but as the weeks went on, I couldn't help but notice his warmth and sharp sense of humor. He had a way of making even the most stressful days feel a little lighter. Our relationship started slowly, almost unintentionally. Late nights at the office turned into shared dinners, and casual conversations about work became deeper talks about life. I was hesitant at first. I'd spent so long building walls to protect myself that letting someone in felt risky. But Mark was patient, never pushing me to share more than I was ready to. One night after we'd won the case, he walked me home. "You know," he said as we stood by my apartment door, "I think you're the most driven person I've ever met, but sometimes it's okay to let someone else carry a little of that weight." His words stayed with me long after he left, and for the first time in years, I felt like maybe I didn't have to do everything alone. As things between Mark and me grew more serious, we started talking about the future, what we wanted in life, where we saw ourselves in 5 or 10 years. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine having a family, something I had avoided thinking about for so long. Mark wanted kids, and so did I, though the thought scared me. I didn't want to repeat the mistakes my parents had made, but with him, it felt possible. It didn't take long for us to realize that building the life we dreamed of would require more than just hard work. Between student loans, rent, and the cost of living in New York, our combined incomes were stretched thin. We both worked long hours, but the idea of starting a family someday made the financial gap seem even larger. Mark was supportive, always reminding me that we were a team. "We'll figure it out together," he said one night as we pored over budgets and savings plans at the kitchen table. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to do more, to push myself even harder to ensure our future was secure. I loved my work at the firm, helping people who felt powerless, using the law to stand up for those who couldn't fight for themselves. It gave me purpose. But the truth was, it didn't pay much. Mark and I weren't struggling, but we weren't building the kind of financial security we needed to start a family either. And as much as I cared about my clients and the mission of the firm, I knew I couldn't ignore the practical side of things forever. One evening, as I reviewed my growing list of cases, I realized something had to change. It wasn't an easy decision. I'd spent years carving out a place for myself in the world of public interest law. But the more I thought about it, the more I knew it was time to move on. I needed to think about the future, not just mine, but ours. Over dinner that night, I told Mark what was on my mind. "I've been thinking," I said, swirling my fork in my pasta, "about applying to some bigger firms. Corporate law, maybe." He looked at me with a mix of surprise and concern. "Are you sure? I know how much you love what you're doing now." "I do," I admitted, "but it's not enough. If we want to start a family someday, we need to plan for it. I want to give our kids the kind of stability I didn't have growing up." He reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "If it's what you want, I'm with you," he said simply. "I know you'll succeed anywhere." As I updated my resume and started researching bigger firms, another thought began creeping into my mind, one I'd spent years pushing away. My family, the people who had abandoned me. I'd told myself I didn't need them, that I was better off without them in my life. But now, with the prospect of starting my own family, I found myself wondering, who were they? What kind of life did they build without me? I didn't know much about them, just fragments of stories I'd pieced together over the years. Mrs. Patel had once mentioned that they were wealthy, part of a prominent community. That fact had always stung. They hadn't left me because they couldn't afford to raise me. They left me because they didn't want me. The bitterness was hard to shake, but curiosity had started to outweigh the pain. I needed to know more. The next day, I called the orphanage. Mrs. Patel had retired years ago, but the new director, a woman named Claire, was kind and eager to help. "We still have some of your records," she said. "Why don't you come by? Maybe we can talk about what you're looking for." I agreed, my stomach tightening as I hung up the phone. I wasn't sure what I'd find, but I knew I had to take the first step. A few days later, I found myself walking through the familiar gates of the orphanage. It had been years since I'd last been there, but the sight of the weathered brick walls and the faint sound of children playing in the distance brought back a flood of memories. Claire, the director, greeted me warmly, her kind smile putting me at ease. "Come on in, Danielle," she said, leading me to her office. I pulled some files I thought might be helpful. We sat down, and she placed a thin folder on the desk between us. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, scanning through the pages of handwritten notes and forms from when I was first admitted. "Your parents," Claire began gently. "They came from a very well-off family. From what I can gather, they owned several businesses and had a prominent position in their community." She paused, gauging my reaction. "They didn't leave you because of financial hardship." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was still a blow. "Do you have anything else about them?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Claire hesitated before sliding a photocopy of a newspaper article across the desk. It was a feature on the Nguyen family, a story about their success, their growing company, and their perfect, polished life. There was a photo of them, my parents, older now but unmistakable, standing proudly next to a young man I knew had to be my brother. They looked so complete, so whole, like I'd never existed. After leaving the orphanage that day, I felt like I'd been split in two. One part of me was desperate for answers, while the other screamed to let it go. What good would it do to dig up the past? They'd made their choice, and I'd made mine. I had worked too hard to let their rejection define me any longer. I shoved the folder of information into a drawer at home and decided to focus on my future instead. A few weeks later, my efforts paid off. I received an offer from a top corporate law firm, exactly the kind of job that could provide the stability I needed to start the life Mark and I had been dreaming of. The pay was incredible, and the opportunity to work on high-profile cases was everything I'd hoped for. When I told Mark, his face lit up with pride. "I knew you'd get it," he said, pulling me into a hug. You deserve this, Danielle. I threw myself into the new role, determined to prove myself all over again. The work was challenging, but I thrived on the pressure. Long hours in the office left little time to dwell on my family or the questions I'd left unanswered. For a while, it seemed like I'd made the right choice, leaving the past where it belonged. A couple of years passed, and life changed in ways I hadn't imagined. Mark and I welcomed our daughter, Mia, into the world, a tiny, perfect bundle of joy who turned our lives upside down in the best possible way. Becoming a mother brought out a side of me I didn't know I had. I wanted to give Mia everything I hadn't had growing up: unconditional love, security, and the unwavering knowledge that she was wanted. At the same time, my career was flourishing. I had become one of the youngest senior attorneys at the firm, handling major clients and earning a reputation for my precision and drive. The long hours were still there, but with Mia waiting for me at home, I found a new balance. Mark was my rock, stepping in whenever I needed to stay late or prepare for a big case. We were building the life we'd dreamed of, one built on mutual respect and love. And yet, every so often, in the quiet moments when I'd rock Mia to sleep, a shadow of the past would creep in. I'd think about the choices my parents made, about how they'd left me behind without a second thought. Holding Mia in my arms, I couldn't fathom how anyone could do that to their child. I pushed the thoughts away, telling myself it didn't matter. I had my family now, the one I'd chosen, the one that mattered. One morning, I walked into my office, coffee in hand, ready to dive into another packed day of meetings and case prep. My assistant knocked lightly on the door just as I was sitting down. "Danielle," she said with a bright smile, "Mr. Roberts wants to see you in his office. He said it's about a new client." I set my coffee down and straightened my blazer, curiosity piqued. New clients were always an exciting challenge, and I prided myself on being the firm's go-to for high-stakes cases. As I stepped into Mr. Roberts' office, he looked up from a stack of papers and gestured for me to sit. "Good morning, Danielle," he began, leaning back in his chair. "We've taken on a significant new client. It's a bit of a complicated case. Financial mismanagement, lawsuits, potential bankruptcy, high profile but discreet. And I think you're the right person for the job." He slid a file across the desk toward me. "This one's all yours." I picked up the folder and flipped it open, scanning the top page. The name at the top made my heart stop. Nguyen Holdings, my parents' business. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the familiar name, the memories of the orphanage and that faded newspaper article rushing back all at once. I looked up at Mr. Roberts, struggling to keep my face neutral. "Thank you," I said evenly. "I'll get started right away." I walked back to my office in a daze, clutching the folder like it might vanish if I let it go. My mind raced, a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't quite pin down. Anger, confusion, curiosity. They all swirled together, leaving me breathless. I closed the door behind me and sat down at my desk, staring at the name on the file. Nguyen Holdings, my parents' company. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat there, torn between the instinct to shove the file into a drawer and forget it existed, or to dive into every detail and see how far they'd fallen. What were the odds that after all these years they'd end up in my office needing my help? The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my whole life trying to forget them, and now they were here, on paper at least, intruding on the life I'd built for myself. After a moment of hesitation, I opened the folder. If I was going to handle this case, or decide not to, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. The first few pages outlined the basic facts. Nguyen Holdings was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, entangled in multiple lawsuits from creditors, partners, and even former employees. It was a financial disaster, the kind that screamed of neglect and mismanagement. As I delved deeper into the documents, one name kept appearing: Bao Nguyen, my brother, the special one, the golden child they'd chosen over me. Apparently, he'd been handed the reins of the company a few years ago and had driven it straight into the ground. Misguided investments, failure to adapt to market trends, and reckless spending had left the business in shambles. Every page I read felt like a punch to the gut. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a shaky breath. It was almost poetic, really. The family that had thrown me away to prioritize their son now sat on the edge of ruin because of him. And here I was, their last hope, the one person who could potentially save them. The irony was as sharp as a blade, cutting through the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. That evening, I walked through the door, still holding the folder like it might slip through my fingers. Mark was in the kitchen, bouncing Mia on his hip while stirring a pot on the stove. The smell of dinner should have been comforting, but I felt too unsettled to notice. "You're home early," he said with a warm smile, glancing at me. "Everything okay?" I hesitated, placing the folder on the counter. "Not really," I admitted. "There's something big I need to tell you." He immediately set Mia down in her playpen and turned to face me, concern etched on his face. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath and told him everything: the new client, the name on the file, and the history I'd spent so many years trying to leave behind. As I spoke, his expression shifted from surprise to disbelief and finally to understanding. "So, let me get this straight," he said, his voice calm but deliberate. "The family who abandoned you is now sitting in financial ruin, and their survival depends on you?" "Pretty much," I said, crossing my arms and leaning against the counter. "It's surreal, isn't it?" Mark shook his head, his brow furrowed. "What are you going to do? Are you even considering taking the case?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but I can't just ignore it. I think I need to meet with them, see what they're like now. Maybe it'll help me figure out what to do." Mark nodded slowly, leaning against the counter across from me. "That's fair. You've always been the kind of person who faces things head-on. Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" I asked, meeting his steady gaze. "Do what's best for you," he said. "Not for them, not for anyone else. You don't owe them anything, Danielle. If you decide to take this case, it has to be on your terms." His words hit me hard, but I nodded. "I'll keep that in mind," I said quietly. "The meeting's tomorrow. After that, I'll decide." Mark walked over and pulled me into a hug, his arms a steady anchor against the storm of emotions swirling inside me. "No matter what you choose," he murmured, "I've got your back." The next morning, I sat at my desk, staring at the phone for what felt like an eternity. My assistant had already reached out to Nguyen Holdings to arrange the meeting, and they'd agreed almost immediately. Now all that was left was to confirm the time. I took a deep breath, picked up the receiver, and dialed. A woman's voice answered on the other end. "Nguyen Holdings, how may I direct your call?" "This is Danielle from Cross & Roberts," I said, keeping my tone professional. "I'd like to confirm the meeting scheduled for tomorrow with Mr. Nguyen." "Of course," she replied cheerfully. "Mr. Nguyen and Mr. Bao Nguyen will be there at 11 a.m. Does that work for you?" My grip on the phone tightened at the mention of Bao's name. "Yes, that works perfectly," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Thank you." As I hung up, my stomach churned. The meeting was set. In less than 24 hours, I'd be sitting face to face with the family who'd left me behind. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. No matter how this meeting went, I knew one thing. I was ready to face them. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling as my mind raced with every possible scenario. What would I say? How would they react? Would they even recognize me? Every time I closed my eyes, their faces from that newspaper article flashed in my mind. Older, but unmistakable. By the time my alarm went off, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. The next morning, I got ready with a focus that was almost robotic, carefully selecting a sleek black suit and pulling my hair into a neat bun. I wanted to project confidence, even if I felt anything but. As I walked into the conference room at 10:50 a.m., I gave myself one last mental pep talk. You've faced tougher challenges, Danielle. You can do this. At exactly 11 a.m., the door opened and they walked in. My father was first, looking every bit as proud and authoritative as I remembered. Behind him was Bao, his features sharper than in the photos but still carrying that same air of privilege. Neither of them gave me a second glance as they approached the table. Ms. Danielle, thank you for meeting with us, my father said, extending his hand. His voice was polite, professional, and utterly devoid of recognition. I shook his hand firmly, my own composure flawless. Of course, I replied evenly. Please, have a seat. As they settled into their seats, I opened the folder in front of me, flipping through the pages with deliberate calm. Let's get right to it, I said, my tone sharp and professional. From what I've reviewed so far, Nguyen Holdings is in a precarious financial situation. Years of mismanagement, reckless investments, and mounting lawsuits have left the company on the brink of bankruptcy. I just couldn't resist. My father stiffened, his face flushed, and I could see the pride and anger building behind his composed exterior. Finally, he snapped. Who do you think you are, questioning me like that? He barked, his voice echoing through the room. For a moment, I just stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. He had no idea. No idea who I was. No idea that the person sitting across from him was the same little girl he deemed unworthy all those years ago. And now I'm here, sitting across from the man who left me behind, demanding my help. Part of me wants to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Another part of me wants to scream. He doesn't even recognize me. He doesn't see the person I've become, the person who's now in control of what happens next. So I'm asking you, what would you do if you were me? Would you confront him here and now, rip off the mask and force him to see the truth? See who the person he abandoned has become? Would you take the case and show him that I'm stronger than he ever gave me credit for? Or would you walk away, leaving him to deal with the mess he and his golden child created? And then there's another thought that keeps creeping in. Should I ruin their lives for good? Should I let their empire crumble and watch them feel the pain they once made me endure? Is that justice? Is that revenge? I don't know anymore. All I know is that whatever I decide will change everything. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm still deciding, and maybe your perspective will help me figure out how this story ends. Hey there! Did you like the story? If you did, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot and makes sure you won't miss out on more great stories we share here. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.
Best friend convinced my wife I was cheating on her, and she ended up... So, a bit of backstory. My wife Katie and I had our daughter last December. The birth was really traumatic for both of us, but especially her. She ended up with postpartum depression and has been in therapy since. We agreed that she'd stay home full-time after everything that happened, so I've been the one bringing in the money. That's been our plan from the start. She'd focus on getting better and taking care of our baby while I worked to cover the bills. Everything was fine for the first few months. She had her therapy sessions, I did my job, and yeah, it was hard, but we were managing. But then, about a couple of months ago, my boss came to me with this project. It was one of those big opportunity things, you know? A lot of overtime, but it would be great for my career and also a nice financial bump for us. I talked to Katie about it, explained that it'd be intense for about 4 weeks, and she was totally on board. We figured her mom and her best friend Molly could help with the baby while I focused on work. Now, Molly's been Katie's best friend forever. She's a stay-at-home mom too, with 2 little kids, so it made sense for her to come over and help out during the day. At first, it was going great. Katie seemed a little more relaxed, Molly was good with the baby, and I felt like we had a solid support system going on. But as the project stretched on, things started to feel off. It was during the 3rd week that I first noticed something weird. Katie was colder with me. I'd come home after a long day, and instead of a normal conversation, she'd just give me these short answers or act distant. At first, I thought she was just tired. I mean, she's dealing with a lot, right? But then I noticed that Molly was hanging around more and more, staying later in the evenings. like way after dinner time, when she'd usually have gone home to her own kids. So one night, I get home, and Molly's there again. It's late, probably around 9 or 10, and instead of heading to bed, she's sitting on the couch with Katie. I say a quick hello and go straight to check on our daughter, like I always do. But as I'm walking down the hall, I hear Molly say something like, "See? He doesn't even stop to greet you first. Definitely a sign." A sign? A sign of what? I turn around, feeling pretty confused, and ask her what she's talking about. And that's when the shit hits the fan. Molly straight up accuses me of having an affair. She says I'm being distant, not paying attention to Katie, and that the long hours at work are just a cover-up. I was so blindsided by it, I didn't even know what to say at first. Then she goes on, saying that I must hate Katie now because she has postpartum depression and gained weight from the pregnancy, and that's why I'm supposedly cheating. I just stood there, stunned. Like, how did we get here? I turned to Katie, thinking she'd laugh it off or tell Molly to stop being ridiculous. But instead, Katie starts crying. Not just a few tears, full-on sobbing. Molly's standing there, arms crossed, looking all self-righteous, and then she demands to see my phone. She said that if I wasn't hiding anything, I should have no problem handing it over. I refused, of course. It's my phone, and I'm not about to let her go through it like I'm some criminal. But then Katie looks up at me, with these sad, tired eyes, and quietly asks if she can see it. At that moment, something broke inside me. I can't even explain it, but the fact that she thought I could actually be cheating on her, after everything we've been through, just wrecked me. I'd been working so hard for us, for her and our daughter, and now she's sitting there thinking I've been sneaking around behind her back. But I loved her, and I wanted to prove her wrong, so I handed her my phone. She goes through it looking for anything suspicious. And guess what? Nothing. There's no affair, no secret messages, no hidden apps. It's just my work emails, texts, and a bunch of dumb memes from my buddies. Molly doesn't back down, though. She starts yelling about how I must have deleted the evidence, like, seriously? That's when our daughter woke up from all the noise, and I lost it. I told Molly to get out of our house. I was done with her. She was causing more harm than good, and I wasn't going to let her keep stirring up this drama. Molly storms out, and I'm left with Katie, who's still crying on the couch. I wanted to comfort her, but I was so mad and hurt that I couldn't even think straight. Once I got our daughter back to sleep, I sat down next to Katie and tried to talk to her. I asked her why she didn't just come to me if she was worried. Why did she listen to Molly over me? She didn't have a real answer. She said she's been scared ever since I started working more, and Molly kept telling her that the extra hours, the overtime, were all signs of an affair. I reminded her that we talked about the project before I even accepted it. We knew it would be intense, but it was supposed to be a good thing for us, not something that'd tear us apart. She finally said she was sorry, that she shouldn't have doubted me. She even apologized for going through my phone. But the damage was already done, you know? Like, even though she said she believed me, the fact that she thought I was capable of cheating just didn't sit right with me. Over the next few days, things were tense. Katie seemed like she was trying to make up for what happened, but I could still feel that cold distance between us. It wasn't the same, and I couldn't stop thinking about how Molly had been planting all these ideas in her head. It wasn't fair. I thought we were supposed to be a team, but it felt like Molly was pulling her away from me. That's when I decided I needed to step back from work. The project was almost over, and I didn't want to give Katie any more reasons to doubt me. I wanted to spend more time with her and our daughter, to show her that I was still here, still committed to our family. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that things would never go back to the way they were. And that was just the beginning. A few days after the whole Molly thing blew up, I thought things were getting back to normal. Katie was still acting a little off, but she wasn't crying or accusing me anymore, so I figured we were slowly moving past it. I even started scaling back on my work hours to be home more. It wasn't easy, but I wanted to prove to Katie that she could trust me. I thought that'd be enough. Boy, was I wrong. One day I get home from work, and the house looks like it's been hit by a tornado. Papers everywhere, drawers pulled out, cushions tossed around. It's like someone ransacked the place. The first thing that hit me was panic, thinking we'd been robbed or something. I shout out for Katie, but there's no answer. Then I hear our daughter crying from her room. When I walk in, she's in her crib, crying her little heart out. And no Katie, no note, nothing. Just a wrecked house and my baby girl totally alone. My mind's racing at this point. I call Katie's phone, but it goes straight to voicemail. I'm trying not to freak out, but I'm freaking out. Did something happen to her? Did she get hurt? Or I don't even know what to think. I start calling around. Her parents, her friends, anyone who might know where she is. No one's seen her. Now I'm really worried. So I call my mom, asking if she can come over and watch our daughter while I try to figure out what the hell is going on. Before my mom can even get to the house, Katie walks in with Molly driving her. I see the car pull up through the window, and I instantly feel a mix of relief and anger. Molly doesn't come in, which I'm honestly thankful for, but Katie walks through the door, eyes red, clearly upset, but not saying a word. I'm standing there in the middle of this wrecked house, holding our crying daughter, and all I can say is, "What the hell happened? Where were you?" And instead of explaining anything, Katie starts yelling. Not like the sad, emotional kind of yelling, but angry, almost like I did something wrong. She's accusing me of cheating again. She says the therapy I told her I was going to start is just a cover-up so I can sneak around and meet my mistress. At this point, I'm just in shock. Like, how are we back to this? We just went through this whole thing a few days ago, and now here we are again? I try to stay calm. I try to explain that I'm going to therapy because I need help dealing with all the stress and everything that's been going on, not because I'm hiding anything, but she doesn't care. She's convinced that everything I say is a lie, and then she does something I never thought she'd do. She hits me, right in the face. It wasn't a slap either, it was a punch. My nose starts bleeding instantly, and I can't even process what just happened. She kind of freezes too, like she didn't expect to do that. Her face goes blank, and she just sits down on the couch, staring at the wall, completely zoning out. No apology, no reaction, nothing. I'm standing there with a busted nose, holding our crying daughter, trying to wrap my head around what just happened. I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that I had to get out of there. Not just for me, but for our daughter's safety. I wasn't going to take any chances after she laid hands on me. If she could do that to me, what if it happened again, but worse? So I call my mom back, telling her to come over ASAP, and while I'm waiting, I pack a bag for our daughter. Katie's still just sitting there, not moving, not saying anything. She's completely checked out. It's like the woman I married is gone, and I'm looking at a stranger. When my mom finally gets there, I explain the situation in the quickest way possible. She's shocked, of course, but she doesn't ask too many questions. We leave Katie on the couch, and I take our daughter to my parents' house. The whole drive over, I'm trying to process everything. Like, how did we go from a happy family to this mess? I know Katie's dealing with a lot mentally, but I never thought things would get this bad. I'm scared for her, but I'm also scared for myself and our daughter. I can't let this keep happening, but I also don't want to just abandon her. She's sick, I know that. But where do I draw the line between helping her and protecting myself? Once we're at my parents' place, I drop off my daughter with my dad and head straight to urgent care. My nose was throbbing the whole time, and I had blood all over my shirt. The doctor said it wasn't broken, but that it was going to be sore for a while. They gave me some pain meds and sent me home. By the time I got back to my parents' house, it was late and my daughter was already asleep. I sat down with my mom, trying to explain everything that happened, but even as I said it out loud, it didn't feel real. My wife had hit me. My wife, the woman I love and had a child with, actually hit me, and now I had no idea what was going to happen next. The next morning, Katie's parents called me. They were obviously worried about her, and I told them what happened. I didn't mention the hitting part, though. I couldn't bring myself to say it, but they knew something was seriously wrong, and they suggested inpatient treatment for her. It was the first time anyone had said something that made sense. We agreed to separate for now. Katie would stay with her parents, and I'd stay at mine with our daughter. I wasn't ready to go straight to divorce, but I couldn't go back to living with her. Not like this. Not after what happened. I needed to protect myself and my daughter, and I couldn't trust Katie to not hurt me again. That night, lying in bed at my parents' house, I realized I needed to do more than just wait for things to get better. I needed to take action, make sure I was legally protected if things went south. I started documenting everything: the ransacked house, the accusations, the hitting. I didn't want to think about a custody battle. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore that it might be coming. My heart was broken. I love Katie, but this wasn't her anymore. This was something else. Something dark and messed up that had taken over. And as much as I wanted to believe she'd get better, I had to face the reality that she might not. So I did the only thing I could do. I kept my distance, prayed for her to get help, and made sure my daughter and I were safe. Update 1. So after that night, I moved in with my parents, like I said. It wasn't easy. Every day I was thinking about what the hell had gone wrong in my marriage. Katie and I had always been close, and now it felt like I didn't even know her anymore. I was trying to focus on my daughter, but it was hard with everything going on. The house, the accusations, the fact that she hit me, it was all just too much. A few days go by and I haven't heard much from Katie. Her parents were doing their best to get her some help, but they were worried too. They didn't know how to handle this any more than I did. My mind was going back and forth, trying to figure out if there was a way to save my marriage. Maybe if Katie got the right treatment, she could come back from this. But the longer I thought about it, the more I realized that I needed to protect my daughter. That had to be my priority. One night, maybe 4 or 5 days after I moved out, I'm just sitting at my parents' house playing with my daughter when I get a call from Katie's dad. He says Katie's been asking to see our daughter. They were trying to get her into inpatient treatment, but she was refusing. Apparently, she was insisting that she could still be a good mom and that this was all my fault. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to let her see our daughter, but another part of me was terrified. I mean, she left her alone before and she hit me. I wasn't sure if it was safe. Katie's dad told me that she wasn't doing well, and he was worried about her mental health. He asked if maybe she could see our daughter, with him and Katie's mom supervising. I agreed, but only if it was in a controlled environment. I wasn't going to let her be alone with our baby, not after everything that had happened. So we set up a visit at her parents' house. The whole drive over, I had this sinking feeling in my stomach. I didn't know what to expect. When I got there, Katie was sitting in the living room looking, well, she looked bad. Her hair was a mess, her eyes were swollen like she'd been crying for days, and she was just staring at the floor. She didn't even look up when I came in with our daughter. Katie's mom tried to make things feel normal, like it was just a regular visit. But it was so awkward. I sat on the other side of the room, holding our daughter, while Katie's parents tried to get her to talk. She didn't say much, just a few words here and there, mostly about how she missed our daughter and how this was all my fault. I could see her mom getting uncomfortable, but she didn't say anything. They were obviously walking on eggshells around Katie. The visit was only about an hour, but it felt like forever. I was relieved when it was over. Katie barely interacted with our daughter at all. She just kept staring at her, and then back at me, like I was the enemy. I tried to talk to her, to ask if she was going to get help, but she just ignored me. Her dad finally stepped in and said it was time to wrap things up, and I was out of there as fast as I could. On the way back home, my phone buzzes. It's a text from Katie. She's angry again, accusing me of turning our daughter against her, saying I was keeping her away on purpose. I didn't even respond. I couldn't. There was no reasoning with her at this point. Every time I tried to explain myself, it just made things worse. Then, a couple of nights later, something crazy happens. It's late, probably around midnight, and I'm about to head to bed when I hear a knock at the door. My heart sinks because I've got a bad feeling about who it could be. I peek through the window and sure enough, it's Katie. She's standing there, looking frantic, with Molly by her side. I open the door just a crack and ask what's going on. Katie starts yelling, saying she wants to take our daughter, that she's her mother and has every right to have her back. I can barely get a word in before she's pushing at the door trying to get inside. I stand my ground, telling her she can't just show up like this in the middle of the night and demand to take our daughter. Molly, of course, is egging her on, telling her that she should call the cops on me, that I'm keeping Katie from her child. At this point, I've had enough. I tell both of them that they need to leave before I call the police myself. Katie's still trying to push her way in, and Molly's standing there, throwing accusations at me like she's some kind of lawyer. Finally, my dad comes to the door. He's a calm guy, but when he saw what was happening, he stepped in and told them to leave. He was polite, but firm, and that seemed to finally get through to them. Katie backs off, and Molly, for once, doesn't say anything. They leave, but not before Katie screams at me that this isn't over. After they left, I just stood there trying to process what had just happened. I mean, who shows up in the middle of the night like that, demanding to take a baby? I knew right then and there that I needed to take more drastic steps. Katie wasn't in her right mind, and as much as I didn't want to escalate things, I had to protect my daughter. The next morning, I made some calls and started looking into getting a restraining order. I never thought my life would turn into this. Just a few months ago, Katie and I were a happy family. We had a beautiful baby girl, and now everything's falling apart. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I do know one thing. I have to keep my daughter safe no matter what, even if that means keeping her away from her own mother. Update 2. So after that late night showdown with Katie and Molly, I knew things were just getting worse. I started the process to get a restraining order. I didn't want to, but I felt like I didn't have a choice anymore. Katie's mental state wasn't stable, and I couldn't risk her showing up at my parents' house in the middle of the night again, demanding to take our daughter. A few days go by, and things are mostly quiet. I wasn't hearing much from Katie or her parents, and I was trying to keep it that way. I was focused on taking care of my daughter and just keeping some kind of normalcy in my life. Then, out of nowhere, I get a call from Katie's mom. She sounds panicked, which immediately puts me on edge. She says Katie's been getting worse, that she's refusing to eat, refusing to talk to anyone, and just sits in her room all day. I ask if she's been to the hospital yet, and her mom says they've tried, but Katie's refusing any kind of help. Now, she's asking for our daughter again, saying that seeing her will fix everything. Hearing that made my stomach drop. I told her mom straight up that I couldn't let Katie see our daughter right now, not in the state she was in. Her mom understood, but she was clearly desperate. She started crying on the phone, telling me she didn't know what else to do. I felt awful, but I had to stick to my guns. Our daughter's safety was my #1 priority. Not long after that, I get a knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I peeked through the window, and it's Molly. Yep, her again. She's standing there with this smug look on her face like she knows something I don't. I open the door just enough to talk, but don't invite her in. I wasn't in the mood for whatever game she was playing. Before I can even say anything, she starts talking. She says Katie's been telling her all about how I'm keeping her baby from her, and that she's going to take action if I don't let her see our daughter soon. I tell Molly that Katie isn't well right now, and that it's not safe for our daughter to be around her. Molly smirks and says, "You know, she's still her mother, and a mother has rights. You don't want this to go to court, do you?" I was so pissed off at this point, but I kept my cool. I told her that Katie's mental health is the main concern, and that's why I can't let her see our daughter until she gets help. Molly gives me this nasty grin and says, "Maybe it's you who needs help. I bet a judge would love to hear about how you've been handling things." That's when I shut the door in her face. I wasn't going to entertain her manipulations anymore. I knew Molly was just trying to get under my skin, and I wasn't falling for it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't bluffing about going to court. A few days later, I get another call, but this time it's from Katie herself. Her voice is shaky and she's crying. She says she's sorry for everything, that she knows she's been acting crazy, and she just wants to make things right. I'll be honest, part of me wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that she was finally realizing she needed help and that we could fix things. But deep down, I didn't trust it. The way things had escalated, it just didn't seem like something she'd come to on her own. It felt like another manipulation. Still, I told her I was glad she was apologizing and asked if she was ready to go to the hospital. That's when the conversation flipped. She started crying harder and saying she didn't need a hospital, she just needed our daughter, that our daughter would make everything better. She even said that once she had her back, I could move back in and we could be a family again. It was like everything came crashing down in that moment. I realized she didn't want help. She just wanted to control the situation, and our daughter was her way of doing that. I told her I couldn't let her see our daughter right now, and that she needed professional help. And then she lost it. She started screaming at me over the phone, saying I was stealing her child, that I was turning everyone against her, and that I was a terrible father. I tried to calm her down, but it was useless. She was completely out of control. I hung up the phone, feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and just plain exhaustion. How did it get this bad? How did we go from a happy family to this disaster? The next day, I got a call from Katie's dad. He told me they were finally taking her to the hospital. Apparently, after that phone call with me, she had another breakdown, and they had no choice but to admit her. I didn't know if I should feel relieved or guilty. I didn't want her to suffer, but I knew this was the only way she'd get better. A few days passed, and things were quiet again. Katie was in the hospital, getting the help she needed. I was finally starting to feel like maybe things were going to settle down. Maybe we could all heal from this. But then, just when I thought things were calming down, I got hit with something I didn't expect at all. Katie's parents called me again, but this time, it wasn't to give me an update on her condition. It was to tell me that Molly had filed a restraining order against me. I couldn't believe it. After everything she'd done, manipulating Katie, trying to break up our family, now she was turning the tables and making me the villain. Apparently, Molly claimed I had been emotionally abusive toward Katie and that I was a danger to both Katie and our daughter. It was all complete bullshit, but the fact that she'd gone to this length was insane to me. I didn't know what she hoped to gain from it, but it was clear she wasn't done messing with my life. Now, I'm not only dealing with my wife's mental health crisis, but I'm also fighting off false accusations from her manipulative best friend. It feels like everything's spiraling out of control, and I don't know what's coming next. Update 3. So after the whole restraining order thing from Molly, I was honestly in shock. I couldn't believe she'd stooped that low. I mean, I was the one trying to keep everything together while my wife was going through her mental health crisis, And now, I'm the one getting accused of being emotionally abusive? It was like something out of a nightmare, and I was living it. I knew the restraining order was bogus, but the fact that she even filed it threw me off completely. I had to lawyer up and fight it, which was just another thing to add to the list of crap I was already dealing with. I spent days preparing with my lawyer, gathering evidence to show the court that Molly was the one manipulating Katie, not me. I had texts, emails, everything, but still I couldn't shake this feeling of dread. What if they believed her? What if this whole thing turned against me? Anyway, the court date came up pretty fast. I walked into that courtroom feeling like I was on trial for something I didn't even do. Molly was there, all smug, like she had already won. Katie's parents were there too, sitting behind her, which hurt even more. I knew they were struggling with everything that had happened, but seeing them take Molly's side, that stung. The judge starts off by letting Molly talk. She goes into this whole dramatic story about how I've been emotionally abusive to Katie, how I've isolated her from her friends, aka Molly, and how I'm keeping her daughter away from her. It was ridiculous, but she said it with such confidence that I could see a couple of people in the courtroom buying into it. I sat there, grinding my teeth, trying to keep my cool. Then it was my turn. My lawyer went through everything: the texts, the emails, the timeline of events. We showed how Molly had been interfering in my marriage, how she'd convinced Katie I was cheating, how she'd escalated things to the point where Katie had a mental breakdown. I even had witnesses, people who knew Molly and knew how she operated, who could back up what I was saying. We laid it all out there, no stone unturned. And guess what? The judge saw right through Molly's lies. The restraining order was thrown out, and Molly was visibly pissed. She stormed out of the courtroom without even looking at me. Katie's parents, though, they just sat there, looking defeated. I don't think they knew what to believe anymore. But even with that little win, it didn't feel like a victory. Not really. I was still dealing with the fallout of everything. Katie was still in the hospital, and I hadn't heard much about how she was doing. Her parents stopped contacting me after the restraining order incident, and I was starting to feel completely cut off from that side of my life. All I had left was my daughter, and I was doing everything I could to keep her safe. A couple weeks later, I got the call that changed everything. It was Katie's mom. She sounded different, not panicked like before, but more calm. And that scared me. She told me that Katie had been asking to see me, that she wanted to talk. I wasn't sure what to expect. Was she getting better? Did she want to apologize? I didn't know, but I agreed to go, more for closure than anything else. So I show up at the hospital, nervous as hell. I hadn't seen Katie in weeks, and the last time we spoke, it didn't exactly go well. When I walked into her room, she looked better. Still not herself, but definitely more put together than the last time I saw her. She didn't look at me right away. She was just staring out the window like she was lost in thought. Finally, she turned to me and said, "I'm sorry." It caught me off guard. After everything that had happened, hearing her apologize was the last thing I expected. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat there, waiting for her to continue. She told me she didn't know what was real anymore, that Molly had filled her head with so many lies that she started to believe them, even when part of her knew they weren't true. She admitted that she felt ashamed of how she treated me, but that she still couldn't understand why I had taken our daughter away. That's when I had to explain everything again, as gently as I could. I told her that it wasn't about me trying to hurt her, but about protecting our daughter. I reminded her of the night she hit me, the night she left our daughter alone in the house. She started crying, saying she didn't remember half of it, that her mind was so foggy back then. It was hard to hear, but I could tell she was being honest. Then she said something that really hit me. "I don't think I can be a mom right now." It was like a punch to the gut, but at the same time, it was a relief. For so long, I'd been holding on to the idea that we could fix this, that Katie could get better and we'd go back to being a family. But hearing her admit that, it made me realize how far gone things were. She wasn't in a place to be a mother, and I had to accept that. We talked for a while longer, mostly about our daughter and what was best for her. Katie said she wanted me to have full custody, at least for now. She needed time to get better, and she didn't want to risk putting our daughter through any more of her instability. It was the hardest conversation I've ever had, but it was also the most honest. When I left the hospital that day, I felt empty, but also like a weight had been lifted. I knew Katie wasn't out of the woods yet, but at least now there was some clarity. I wasn't living in this constant state of uncertainty anymore. I had a path forward, even if it wasn't the one I imagined when we first had our daughter. So here I am now. I've got full custody of my daughter, and I'm trying to build a life for the two of us. Katie's still in treatment, and I visit her occasionally, but things aren't the same. I don't know if they ever will be. but at least I know I did everything I could. And now, it's about moving forward, one step at a time. Kicked out as a teen for false rumors spread by my brother, years later, parents see my success and demand money after they abandoned me. Growing up with a twin brother should have been like having a lifelong ally, someone to share every triumph and challenge. But for me, it was more like living in the shadow of someone who was always in the spotlight. From the beginning, it was clear who was the golden child and who wasn't. My brother Matt was everything my parents wanted in a child. Studious, serious about the future, and a mirror image of their own aspirations. I, on the other hand, was the other twin, the one who preferred climbing trees to reading books, who'd rather throw a soccer ball than sit through another piano lesson from as early as I can remember. My parents made no secret of their differing expectations for us. They praised Matt for every day he brought home and scolded me for every B that marred my report card. They talked about his future with bright, shining terms, scholarships, prestigious universities, a lucrative career. Conversations about my future, however, were filled with warnings and worries, as if my preference for athletics over academics was a problem they needed to fix. This disparity wasn't just confined to academic achievements or future prospects. It spilled over into every aspect of our lives, including how we celebrated personal milestones like birthdays. Every year, Matt's birthday was a grand event. Our parents threw elaborate parties for him, inviting all his friends from school and filling our backyard with balloons, games, and laughter. There would be magic shows, his favorite foods, and a towering cake that seemed to touch the ceiling. In stark contrast, my birthdays felt like afterthoughts. If Matt's birthdays were a symphony, mine were a solo. No friends running around our living room, no streamers in my favorite colors, just a small family dinner and a cake that looked like it was bought in a hurry. I remember feeling a mix of resignation and envy as I watched Matt blow out his candles with a beaming smile, surrounded by friends and gifts. Knowing that my own celebration would never come close, the only person who seemed to really see me was my grandmother. She had a way of making me feel special in a way my parents never did. Whenever she visited, she brought with her a warmth that filled the house. She'd always smuggle me a box of my favorite chocolate truffles, hiding them in her suitcase until she could give them to me in private, away from the indifferent glances of my parents. "Keep your spirits up, darling," she'd whisper, slipping a few dollars into my hand. "Buy something nice for yourself. Something just for you." As I grew older, the favoritism became more pronounced, turning into what felt a lot like emotional abandonment. My parents attended every one of Matt's soccer games, cheering loudly from the sidelines, yet they rarely made it to my track meets. And when they did, they'd spend most of their time on their phones or discussing Matt's latest achievements with other parents. The emotional toll was heavy. I started to internalize their disapproval, feeling as though I was somehow less deserving of attention and love than Matt. I'd lie in bed at night listening to the distant sounds of laughter from Matt's room, where he and his friends played video games or watched movies. Meanwhile, my room felt like a silent bubble cut off from the rest of the world. High school can be a battleground or a playground depending on who you are and what your family background looks like. For me, it leaned more towards a battleground, a place where I had to navigate not just academic pressures, but also the minefield that was my relationship with my family, particularly my twin brother Matt. As we stepped into the more demanding years of our education, the disparity in how my parents treated us didn't just remain at home. It followed me like a shadow. Matt was placed on a pedestal. His achievements in school magnified and celebrated. My own, if acknowledged, were met with a nod or a fleeting smile, nothing more. It was during these years that the tension between us grew palpable, stretching, thin, the fraternal bond that was supposed to exist between siblings. It wasn't just the lack of attention from my parents that stung. It was their outright criticism of my interests and hobbies. I'd always been athletic, finding solace in sports and physical activities. However, my parents saw this as a distraction. They believed that time spent on the track or the field was time wasted, time that could be better spent with my nose buried in textbooks. One afternoon, a pivotal incident crystallized their disapproval into outright prohibition. I had just come home buzzing with excitement for making the varsity soccer team. I remember bounding into the kitchen, eager to share the news, thinking that perhaps this achievement would finally earn me a sliver of the praise usually reserved for Matt. The reaction, however, was cold, dismissive. "We'd rather you focus on your studies like your brother," my dad said, barely looking up from the newspaper. "Sports won't get you into a good college." The frustration of being constantly compared and found lacking was infuriating. I argued. Pled had tried to explain how important this was to me, not just as a pastime, but as something that truly made me happy. The response was unequivocal. no extracurricular activities until your grades improve to our expectations. My mom declared, ending the conversation feeling cornered and misunderstood. I retreated to my room, anger simmering within me. The lack of control over my own choices was suffocating. It was as if my desires and passions were secondary to an image of who I should be, an image crafted meticulously by my parents without any input from me. This parental pressure cooker only worsened with an incident that, to them, was the last straw. It happened innocently enough. I had downloaded Snapchat to stay in touch with my friends, a common enough activity for teenagers my age. But when my parents discovered the app on my phone during one of their routine checks, they reacted as if I had committed a serious transgression. Their fury was disproportionate. They yelled, accused me of being secretive and untrustworthy. You're just like your friends, wasting your life away with these distractions. My mom shouted as she threw my phone across the room. The screen cracked against the wall, the physical damage mirroring the emotional rift that widened between us as a punishment. They took the door off its hinges in my room. No privacy for someone who can't be trusted, my dad said grimly. As he removed the last screw, I was left feeling exposed and vulnerable, my personal space violated. It was a stark reminder of how little say I had in my own life under their roof. But the real damage was done by Matt, who saw this as an opportunity to further ingratiate himself with our parents. Instead of standing by me, he sided with them, adding his own accusations to theirs. She's always hiding things from you, he would say, casting me in a suspicious light whenever he could. His words were like fuel to the fire, reinforcing their worst perceptions of me. Matt's betrayal didn't stop at home. He took his deceitful narrative to school, spreading rumors and lies about my behavior. He told anyone who would listen that I was a troublemaker, that I partied too much, that I was likely to end up failing out of school. His words, though baseless, carried weight, and soon I noticed a shift in how my classmates treated me. Whispers followed me in the hallways. Friends who used to greet me with smiles now offered only cool nods or avoided my gaze altogether. It was as if Matt's version of me, a distorted, malicious caricature, was replacing the real me in the eyes of our peers. The situation reached a tipping point during a particularly heated argument at home about my supposed lack of ambition. Why can't you be more like your brother? My parents would often say, and during this argument, those words cut deeper than ever. I shouted back something I rarely dared to do because I'm not Matt. I don't want to be him. The house went silent. My outburst had startled them, and for a moment I saw something like shock on their faces. But it quickly morphed into anger, and any hope that they might finally listen to me evaporated. That night, lying in bed, I realized that the gap between us was too wide to bridge. My own family saw me as an outsider, an aberration in their perfect little world. The emotional toll was immense, and I found myself withdrawing, building walls around my heart to protect it from further hurt. School became a place to endure rather than enjoy, and home was no sanctuary. The conflict at home reached a fever pitch during my sophomore year of high school. The mounting pressure for my parents to excel academically and emulate my brother's path was suffocating. Coupled with Matt's continued efforts to tarnish my reputation both at home and at school, I felt cornered, constantly on edge, as if I were balancing on a tight rope with no safety net below. It was around this time that an incident occurred that would become the catalyst for an even greater divide in our family. It was a small thing, really something that should have been inconsequential. But in the high-strung atmosphere of our household, it was like lighting a match in a room soaked with gasoline. I'd been doing well in a couple of subjects that term, pulling in grades that were on par with Matt's. I remember feeling a flicker of pride, a rare sensation given the usual cloud of criticism that hung over me. Eager to share something positive with my parents, I approached them one evening with my report card in hand, hoping that maybe this time they would see me as more than just the other twin. Their reaction was underwhelming. While they acknowledged my good grades with a nod, the conversation quickly turned back to Matt and his recent acceptance into a prestigious summer program, a topic that dominated our dinner discussions for weeks. My achievement was brushed aside, the moment of potential connection crumbling away before it had a chance to solidify. This pattern of neglect had a profound effect on me, deepening the chasm of isolation I felt at home. My relationship with my parents became more transactional than emotional. Conversations were brief, limited to necessities, rather than any real exchange of thoughts or feelings. I felt like a guest in my own home, tiptoeing around, always on the verge of being reprimanded or dismissed. As the school year progressed, Matt's behavior escalated from passive-aggressive comments to outright confrontations. He seemed to derive a twisted sense of satisfaction from my discomfort, often provoking arguments in front of our parents, knowing they would take his side. One such argument erupted over something as trivial as the remote control for the TV. Matt wanted to watch a documentary for a school project, and I was halfway through a movie I had been looking forward to all week. When I refused to give up the remote, Matt turned to our parents, playing the victim, claiming I was always hostile towards him, and that I never supported his academic efforts. The argument spiraled quickly. Voices raised, harsh words were exchanged, and in the heat of the moment, Matt claimed that I was jeopardizing his chances of success by being petty and selfish. The accusation was ludicrous, but my parents bought into his narrative, chastising me for being inconsiderate and telling me to apologize. Humiliated and frustrated, I stormed out of the room, the injustice of the situation burning in my chest. It was clear that no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, I would always be in the wrong in their eyes. This continual side-taking emboldened Matt, and he began to spin more elaborate tales about my behavior. At school, he told his friends and anyone else who would listen that I was a troublemaker at home, that I was ungrateful and rebellious. His stories painted me as the villain in our household drama, a narrative that began to seep into my social life, affecting my relationships with classmates and friends. The real breaking point came during an incident that not only shattered my relationship with my family, but also marked the beginning of my journey toward independence. It happened on a day that it started like any other. I was in the kitchen making myself a sandwich when Matt walked in. His demeanor was confrontational, his gaze accusatory, without provocation. He started an argument berating me for using the last of the bread, knowing full well that our parents were within earshot. As the argument escalated, Matt did something that I would never have expected. In a fit of anger, he shoved me. The force of his push caught me off guard, sending me stumbling backward into the counter. The pain was sharp, and the shock of his physical aggression left me momentarily stunned. This physical altercation marked a new low in our relationship when our parents rushed into the kitchen. Matt quickly played the victim, claiming that I had provoked him, that he had merely defended himself. I tried to explain to tell them he had pushed me first, but my words fell on deaf ears. Their faces were set, their disappointment in me evident. The injustice of it was overwhelming. Not only had I been physically hurt by my own brother, but I was also being blamed for the incident. It was a clear sign that my place in the family was contingent on my compliance and silence, and even then I was not guaranteed fair treatment. That night, as I lay in my room, the door still off its hinges, the reality of my situation settled in. I was alone in a family that did not see me in a home where I was not safe to express myself or even defend myself. The emotional and physical barriers that had been building over the years had finally solidified into an insurmountable wall. My brother's jealousy reached a boiling point during our 14th birthday party when no one showed up for him on his birthday. I have no idea why his friends did that to him, but in stark contrast, my friends took me out for ice cream, and I had an overall wonderful day. This infuriated my brother, further to take revenge. My brother began to spread false rumors at school about me where he would portray me as a spoiled brat. He would falsely tell everyone that I was allegedly physically abusing him at home, since our parents loved him more. Unbeknownst to me, he took things to a disturbing level to fabricate evidence. He would punch himself purposefully, inflicting injuries like a black eye or bruised shoulder. The next day, he would confidently walk into school displaying the self-inflicted injuries as proof of my supposed violence and make up stories. Whenever our parents questioned him about the injuries, he would lie, saying that it was due to innocent activities like playing football with his friends. The lies and his alleged black eye started to gain traction, and people began to believe his distorted version of events. It wasn't long before whispers started circulating, and even my friends began to look at me with suspicion. At first, I noticed subtle changes. Friends who once chatted with me in the hallway suddenly became distant. Invitations to group hangouts became fewer and farther between. It was like a switch had been flipped, and people were hesitant to associate with a supposedly spoiled girl accused of violence. One day, I mustered the courage to ask my ex-best friend why things had changed between us. She opened up about how my twin brother had been spreading rumors about me. She revealed the detailed lies he had told everyone, accusing me of things I'd never done. I was shocked to hear her words. The feeling was a mix of disbelief and betrayal, as if the ground beneath me had given way. My brother, someone I grew up with, was spreading lies about me, accusing me of things I would never even dream of doing. It was a betrayal that cut deep, leaving me with a knot in my stomach and a heavy heart. I confronted my brother the day after our school, but he chose to ignore me. I begged him to stop lying about me, but he smirked at me and told me that I deserved to rot alone. I was at a loss for words because his lies and behavior were starting to scare me. I wanted to talk to my parents, but I was afraid that they would believe my brother over me. The isolation stung, especially because I'd always been open to making friends. It felt like my brother's jealousy-fueled lies were tearing down the connections I had built over the years. Teachers, too, began to catch wind of the rumors. It was a surreal experience, as if I were living in a parallel reality where my true self was overshadowed by the malicious story spun by my own twin. The lies had grown beyond mere teenage gossip. They were now shaping how people truly perceive me. The nasty rumor quickly reached my principal's ears, and then my worst nightmare came true. The principal immediately called me and my brother into his room, as well as our parents, so we could discuss these alleged rumors. I sat there heart pounding as the principal demanded the truth. I hoped my brother would finally come clean, but instead he doubled down on the lies. He straight up told the principal that, yeah, the rumors were true and painted me as this bully who went around beating him up when our parents weren't around. I couldn't believe it. Shock washed over me as my brother continued, spinning this twisted story about how I was angry at him for getting more love from our parents. It was all a bunch of lies. But he stuck to his story like glue. My mom began to cry, hearing my brother's story, holding on to my brother like he was some kind of hero. My dad tried to comfort my brother, telling him that it was brave for him to speak up and that he was not going to make sure that nothing would ever happen to him after that day. I tried to defend myself, pleading with the principal that it was all made up. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of accusations, desperately trying to swim to the surface. But my brother kept at it, insisting that I was this angry, violent person taking out my frustrations on him every day. My mom's tears kept coming as she held on to my brother, giving me accusing looks. It was like fighting against a wall of belief in my brother's made-up story. My principal reprimanded me strongly, saying the school didn't tolerate bullying, and these were grounds to suspend me. I pleaded with him not to suspend me, but he shook his head, saying he couldn't just let it slide. I begged him, tears streaming down my face, trying to tell him that I didn't do anything to my brother. The principal firmly told me that I would be suspended for 10 days so that others see this as an example to never bully anyone. It hit me hard, and I started crying even more, practically begging him to reconsider. My parents, angry and embarrassed by the whole situation, dragged me out of the principal's office. I didn't want to leave. I wanted to plead my case and make them understand, but they were having none of it. We left the school, my heart heavy with frustration and humiliation. When we got home, things took a drastic turn. My dad started packing up my stuff out of the blue. I was shocked, confused, and had no idea what was happening. My mom asked him what he was doing, but he just shouted that he couldn't let me live in the same house as my brother anymore. I was crying practically on my knees and pleaded with my brother to tell them the truth, but he stayed cold, unmoved by my emotions. My dad continued packing my things and then threw the suitcase into our foyer. I clung to my dad's legs, still begging him not to throw me out. It was like a nightmare unfolding. He told me that a bully like me didn't deserve to live in his house and that he would ask his mother, my grandmother, to come and pick me up if she wanted to do that. It felt like the world had crumbled beneath me. I stood there in shock, surrounded by my belongings, scattered in the foyer, or kicked out of my own home. Eventually, my grandmother did show up. She gathered all my things and helped me place them in the car, helping me into the passenger seat. She made sure I had my seatbelt on before walking towards my parents' front door. She rang the doorbell, and when my dad opened the door, she started to yell at him for treating me this way with stern determination. She warned him that if he ever approached me or tried to contact me again, she wouldn't hesitate to involve the police or the CPS, since what he had done to a child like me could potentially wind up with him in jail. My mother, attempting to deflect blame, told her that it was my fault. However, my grandmother wasn't having any of it. She stood her ground defending me, emphasizing that I was just a child who didn't deserve to be treated in such a heartless manner. That was the first time in my life I felt how powerful my grandmother was. She didn't cower down to my parents, and unlike what they believed, she trusted me. Eventually, we drove away, leaving behind my home, the only place I had ever grown up in. I can't even begin to put into words how indescribable the pain I felt during that time. I remember just crying on the bed, not eating anything, despite how much my grandmother urged me to. I told her what my brother had done, and she was shocked as well. She assured me that she believed my side of the story, and I was happy that I at least had one person who had my back. When the 10 days of suspension lifted, the prospect of returning to school felt like stepping back into a lion's den. As I entered the familiar hallways, the faces of my classmates spoke volumes, judgment whispers, and sidelong glances. The weight of the false accusations continued to linger in the air. Meanwhile, my brother blatantly ignored me and acted like I didn't exist. He had become friends with a few people who believed his side of the story and saw him as the victim of my attacks. No matter how much I tried to tell my side of the story to anyone, it fell on deaf ears. I was an outcast, branded with an unjust label that clung to me like a shadow. No matter where I went, the classroom, the cafeteria, the corridors, the eyes that met mine were filled with disdain and mistrust. I became a loner. I would keep my head down and attend all my classes, have lunch alone in the cafeteria, and would straight go back home. I had no friends, and it felt like everyone pretty much didn't want me there. Throughout all this, my parents never once called to check up on me. My grandmother would constantly remind me that this was not my fault and that life would eventually be okay. I graduated high school with good grades and was looking forward to college where hopefully I would have a better life. It was only when I went away to college that I first experienced what freedom felt like for the first time. No one was watching over my shoulders. No one was comparing my grades, and no one was trying to compete with me. I met people and formed friendships with like-minded individuals. Despite the emotional and physical scars I had sustained over the years due to my family and peers, I concentrated on putting it all behind me and enjoying this college experience as much as I could. During this time, I discovered my knack for content writing. I had always been someone who wanted to be a writer, but I wasn't sure if it would be sustainable for a long time. Hence, I decided to ditch my dream, but to earn some seed money. I decided to start writing as a freelancer. I signed up on various freelancing sites, which helped me secure jobs from prominent clients. This is how I slowly started building a portfolio of my work. Throughout college, I maintained this side hustle and never asked for a penny from my parents. When I graduated from college, instead of getting a corporate job, I realized that I could pursue content writing as a full-time job. I was doing quite well because of the multiple clients and the long-term professional relationships I had with them, which allowed them to rope me in multiple projects of theirs. Having a legitimate freelancing career not only made me financially independent, but also allowed me to travel the world as a digital nomad. Traveling helped heal me from my past. Even though it was definitely not easy, I saved up as much as I could and took a chance on myself. Over the years, I've seen so much of the world, and yet I have so much of it left to see. The only person who I considered my family throughout all this was my grandmother, and I absolutely adored her. She was very sad when I moved out, but she understood that I needed to be independent on my own. Despite my hectic schedule, I would make it a point to be there for her whenever I could. I would visit her on the weekends, often sharing meals together or simply sitting on the porch, engrossed in conversations that ranged from childhood tales to more recent happenings. On weekends, I would dedicate entire afternoons to helping her with household chores or accompanying her to the local park for a leisurely walk. Recently, I got done with one of the most important projects of my career. I can't mention the brand, but I was extremely lucky to write blogs and product descriptions for them. After the project was done, I requested the team I worked with to leave me positive reviews on my websites, which they were more than happy to do. So I then took screenshots of some of their reviews to post on my Instagram, as I knew working with this brand was a huge deal. As expected, a lot of other content writers reached out to congratulate me on my professional success and even reposted my story to help spread the word. This is how I started getting messages from strangers who also needed help with their website. My relatives noticed this as well, and some of them reached out to congratulate me. Eventually, I was contacted by my college's principal. He had reached out to me after seeing that I was doing so well and wanted me to come to college for a seminar to talk to students about building a career as a content writer. I was quite nervous as I don't do well when it comes to public speaking, but I decided to take a chance and agreed when I found myself standing before eager faces. Sharing my experiences and insights, I felt like my life had come full circle. I spoke in my speech about the struggles I faced and how I worked hard to sustain myself despite all the hard days. It was honestly a very fulfilling experience to empower others and contribute to the growth of the writers' community. Some of my clips started going viral on Facebook groups as people reasoned with it. It felt good to be finally recognized for my hard work. Last week, I was invited to speak at a local news channel. It was a show about the benefits of content writing, and they invited me to share my journey and insights with their viewers. I was a bit nervous, but also excited for the opportunity. During the show, I talked about my experiences, the importance of client reviews, and how a simple appreciation post could open doors to incredible opportunities. The opportunity to reach a broader audience and inspire more individuals in the field was both humbling and exhilarating. When it finally aired, I shared some of these clips on my Instagram also, as I was proud about being invited to a TV show. This is how my relatives and cousins started finding out how well I was doing in my career. You see, because my parents never talked about me to anyone, they had no idea that I was working with popular brands and getting invited to TV shows. This is how word quickly spread within my family. I guess this TV interview must have finally reached my parents' ears also, because just a few days later I was working on another project and had my phone on silent. when I was done with my work. I checked my phone, and to my surprise, there were 6 missed calls from my mom. I was honestly shocked to see her name on my phone, as it had been a long, long time since she had called me after all those years of silence. I couldn't fathom why she was calling me. I hesitatingly called her back and she picked up immediately. I asked her if everything was okay, and my mom started to congratulate me. My dad, probably sitting right there with mom, jumped into the conversation. Also, he started to inquire about my life and well-being, and I answered their questions without much thought. It didn't strike me as unusual until they began to ask how much I was earning these days. I told them that it was none of their business, and my dad replied that we were family, so I shouldn't feel shy telling them my income. I told them that I was doing well financially by hearing this. My mom then began to say how hard their life was these days. My brows furrowed in suspicion. Basically, here's how our conversation pretty much went. Mom, we are retired now, and we have been wanting to renovate the house for a while now. It's not in the best shape, but we have no savings left me. Okay, Mom, your success has given us hope. After watching your TV interview today, we thought maybe you could help us out by paying for the renovations. Dad, after all, we are a family. You shouldn't hesitate to share some of your earnings with us. We can really use your help. Me? Are you joking with me? Why are you asking me for money when you haven't even talked to me for years? I don't know what made you decide to reach out to me. And while I appreciate the congratulations, I'm not going to help you out in any way. Hearing this, my mom started saying how I was being a bitch and that I needed to support them as a family. My dad also added that as my parents, they deserved to be looked out after, and that this was the least that we could do. I was so pissed at this that I wanted to give them a piece of my mind. I suddenly got an idea that instead of just arguing with them, I should teach them a lesson forever, thinking that they could mooch off me after mistreating me all those years ago. I told my parents that I was willing to help them if and only if they agreed to my demands. My dad curiously asked me what it was without hesitation. I laid out my demand if they wanted my help. They had to publicly admit in front of our family and friends that my brother was the mastermind behind the hurtful rumors that had tarnished my reputation. I wanted them to humiliate my brother the same way they had humiliated me in front of everyone by believing his lies and manipulations. I wanted them to take accountability for their actions and acknowledge the pain they had caused. Hearing my impossible condition, my dad began to question the necessity of such an admission. My mom told me how this was all quite unnecessary and that we could have a private discussion without involving others, but I held my ground. This condition was non-negotiable or a prerequisite for any assistance they wanted me to offer them in the future. As the tension escalated, my dad raised his voice, asserting his role as my father, and started to emphasize that it was my duty to help my family in need. My mom, in a last-ditch effort, urged me to do the right thing and help them, emphasizing the years they had spent raising me. I couldn't help but find irony in their sudden appeal. I reminded them of the past, of the fact that they had kicked me out, and it was my grandmother who had raised me, not them. They started to get more and more agitated, but I told them firmly that if they wanted to establish contact with me and seek my financial assistance from now on, then the truth needed to be acknowledged publicly, and my brother needed to face consequences for his actions. Since this conversation, my parents have been trying to incessantly call me, but I'm ignoring their calls. I'm starting to regret even calling them back that day. I would like to know if I would really be in a hole if I didn't help my parents at all. Update 1. It's been a whirlwind of a week since I last shared my story, and the support and encouragement I have been receiving from everyone has been overwhelming. It's heartening to know that I'm not alone during this time. I am glad that everyone agrees that I should not engage with my parents or even consider helping them out after what they put me through. The reason I even gave them such a condition was because I knew it was pretty much impossible for them to do it. I know they love my brother too much, and despite the fact that they might have found out by now that it was all his lies, I know they will never put him through what they put me through today. My brother sent me a nasty text message after my parents again tried to contact me, and I refused to pick up their calls. This is what he wrote. He says, "It's been a long time since I saw you, and I can tell you that every day without you in my life has been great. I heard that Mom and Dad reached out to you and you gave them a crazy ultimatum. They are never going to go through with it. You know that, right? They clearly never loved you, and they will never do anything to hurt me. I admit that I did lie about you 15 years ago, but it's been a long time since then. So stop being so selfish and try to move on from the past. You are unmarried and childless anyway, so why do you not want to help them out by paying for their repairs and renovations around the house? Do the right thing and be a better daughter. Seeing the message felt like a stab to my chest. The audacity to dismiss the struggles I had faced and the conditions I had set spoke volumes about his lack of empathy. The attempt to guilt-trip me by emphasizing my unmarried and childless status added another layer of insensitivity. His insinuation that I should prioritize their needs over my own well-being was not only offensive, but also highlighted how little he thought of me. Fueled by frustration and a strong desire for justice, I decided it was time to take matters into my own hands and reveal the truth that had been hidden for too long. I sat down to write an email to my parents and close relatives, sharing the painful details of my childhood and the unfair treatment I had endured while growing up at my family house. In the email, I described the strict and oppressive environment I had under my parents' roof and how they treated me compared to my twin brother. The email also delved into the malicious and completely untrue rumor my brother had spread about me in school, which had led to severe consequences and affected my reputation. I wrote how my parents had kicked me out to the curb, and had it not been my grandmother, I might have been dead in the streets by now. Towards the end, I asked everyone to read a message my brother had sent me. I attached a screenshot where he admitted to lying about me. It was a clear confession that I hoped would expose the lies that had persisted for too long. I sent the email just an hour ago, and I know that all hell will break loose once my parents and my brother read it. I will update you next regarding how my family reacts to my email update too. It's been a month since my last update, and a lot of things have happened this month. As you can imagine, my family did erupt after receiving the email. My parents have received criticism from relatives who were previously unaware of the extent of the favoritism and emotional abuse. A lot of the family members reached out to me telling me that they had no idea about all this and apologized to me for not being there for me. My brother and my parents sent me a barrage of text messages that were starting to get more abusive and violent. So I decided to reach out to a lawyer who sent them a notice of cease and desist. It basically warned them to not contact me further, and if they did, they would have to face dire legal consequences. I guess this must have scared them straight because they stopped contacting me. My grandmother thinks I've done the right thing by letting everyone know what happened and supports me 100%. She's the only person who matters to me, so I'm glad she has my back. Update 3. It's been 2 months since my last update. I am happy to report that everything in my life is going well for now. Professionally, my content writing business has been flourishing. The invitations to speak at seminars and podcasts continue to roll in, solidifying my position as a respected figure in my line of work. I am as close to my grandmother as ever. I took a 1-week break from my work recently so I could spend some quality time with her. She's into gardening these days and educated me a lot about various flowers and herbs in her garden. The moments I spent with her, whether sharing meals, engaging in heartfelt conversations, or simply enjoying each other's company, are my favorite and cherished memories. My family has not contacted me after the letter they received from my lawyer, so I'm happy that they are staying away from me. Personally, I have started going to therapy, so hopefully I can work on healing myself. I think this will be the last update for now. Husband wants a divorce because he found someone else, but got mad when I didn't care. So, a couple of weeks ago, I was getting ready for this work event, right? We were all supposed to meet up and have a good time, and honestly, I was looking forward to just getting out of the house for once. Anyway, as I'm putting on my shoes, my husband, well, ex-husband now, Daniel, comes up to me and says, "We need to talk." And I'm like, "Okay, sure, what's up?" Thinking it's something normal like a bill or something about the kids. But nah, he goes, "I've met someone. I'm leaving." Just like that. Now, we've been married for 10 years, together for 15, and we've got 2 boys, Owen and Logan, 12 and 11. So this wasn't just some casual breakup, you know? This was the end of our family, our marriage, everything. And the crazy part is, I didn't even feel that heartbroken about it. Like, yeah, I was hurt, but the relief I felt almost overpowered that. I guess I was waiting for this to happen for a long time. We hadn't been happy for a few years now. We were living more like roommates than a married couple, only talking about the kids or what groceries we needed. Honestly, the only time we really acted like we were still married was in the bedroom, and even that had been well, not great for a while. But still, hearing him actually say it out loud, that he was leaving me for someone else, it hit different. I felt like, okay, so that's it then. I was relieved that at least one of us had the guts to call it quits. But at the same time, I was wondering, why now? Why couldn't we have just, I don't know, tried a little harder? So Daniel's sitting there, explaining how it's all going to go down. He's already found some one-bedroom apartment and says he'll move out until we can figure out what to do with the house, the kids, all that. He's talking like he's got it all planned out, while I'm just sitting there, not saying much, just nodding along. Honestly, it felt like I was floating outside my body, just watching this whole thing unfold like it wasn't even happening to me. You ever feel that? Like, this can't be your life. It's too ridiculous to be real. Anyway, once he finishes, I realize I'm already an hour late for the work event. So I grab my phone to order an Uber, not wanting to deal with any more of this nonsense. While I'm waiting outside for my ride, I get a text from Mark, one of my coworkers, asking why I'm so late. Without thinking much of it, I text back something like, "Oh, Mark, you don't even know the half of it. My husband just dumped me, so I'm free now, haha." But guess what? I didn't send that text to Mark. I sent it to Daniel. Yep. And of course, the second I realized, it was too late to take it back. Now you'd think Daniel wouldn't care, right? Like, he's leaving me for some younger woman, why would he give a damn about what I think? But no. That text set him off. He storms out of the house, furious, accusing me of being heartless like I'm the villain here. "How can you joke about something like that?" he yells. And I'm just standing there like, "Dude, you literally just told me you're leaving me for someone else. What do you expect me to do? Beg you to stay?" I tried explaining that it was just a stupid text, part of this inside joke we've got going at work. I mentioned how a bunch of my coworkers have been splitting up recently, so we've been joking about how our department is cursed, like whoever works there is doomed to get divorced. But did he care? Nope. He was too pissed about the fact that I wasn't falling apart the way he probably expected me to. It's like he wanted me to beg or cry or something, but I was just done. And honestly, I think that's what pissed him off the most, that I wasn't falling apart over him leaving. So now, instead of sticking to his grand plan of moving out, Daniel decides he's going to stay. Suddenly, he's not so sure about the divorce. He's going back on everything he just told me, and instead of having a rational conversation like adults, he starts ignoring me, giving me the silent treatment. Anytime I ask him about his plans, like when he's moving out, he just brushes me off, or straight up doesn't answer. One day, in one of the few conversations we actually had, he says something about how he was going to be generous with me during the divorce, but now, because of that stupid text, he's going to take me for everything I've got. I'm not even kidding. He really thought that text was some kind of betrayal. I just looked at him and said, "You can't take what I don't care about. All I want is my freedom." And that's when he lost it. He slapped me, right across the face, hard. I never ever thought he'd do something like that. In all our years together, he'd never laid a hand on me. I was in shock. It wasn't even the pain that got me, though. It was the fact that he did it. Daniel, the man I'd trusted with my life for over a decade. The man who was the father of my kids. And the weirdest part? Later that night, I heard him crying in the bathroom, like he was the one who was hurt. I couldn't wrap my head around it. How do you go from slapping your wife to crying like you're the victim? I'm 42. Daniel's 45. We've got two boys who have no idea what's going on. I moved into the living room because I couldn't stand to sleep next to him after that. But of course, he's acting like I'm the one who's done something wrong. He's refusing to move out, dragging his feet on the divorce, and now he's talking about taking the house, the kids, everything. All because I didn't cry when he told me he was leaving. At this point, I'm just waiting it out. I've already got a lawyer, and I'm documenting everything. I didn't think it would get this bad, but here we are. It's funny how quickly things can spiral when someone's ego gets bruised. So, things went from bad to worse after that whole slap incident. I guess I thought, okay, this is rock bottom. But no, Daniel somehow found a way to make everything even worse. He started acting like I was the one in the wrong. Like he would give me these cold, dead stares when we were in the same room. And anytime I tried to bring up the divorce or the kids, he'd just act like I didn't exist. I remember one night I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner and he comes in, completely ignores me, walks past like I'm invisible. Then out of nowhere he says, "You know, I was planning to make this easy on you. I wasn't going to make things difficult. But now, you're going to regret that text for the rest of your life." I just stood there, staring at him, trying to figure out if this was real. He's mad about a text? I didn't even cheat on him or anything. It was a dumb joke, and it wasn't even meant for him. But here we are, with him acting like I committed some unforgivable crime. He even had the nerve to tell me he's going to take me for everything, like our kids, the house, and my peace of mind weren't enough for him. I asked him straight up, "What are you talking about? You're leaving me." It felt like he was playing some twisted game with my head. I asked him, "What about Alyssa?" "That's the 25-year-old girl he left me for. in case I forgot to mention her earlier. He said, I'm not sure about her anymore. She's starting to be a little clingy, and she wants kids. You know I can't have any more kids after the vasectomy. I just sat there trying to process what he was saying. So he's already having problems with his new girl, and now he wants to maybe try to fix things with me, like I'm some backup plan in case his fling doesn't work out? No, I wasn't having it. But of course, he keeps pushing. He starts reminiscing about the good times we had, talking about how we've got the kids, how we've built a life together. And honestly, for a split second, I almost thought about it. I almost considered what it would be like to try again. For the kids, for the house, for whatever. But then I snapped back to reality and remembered the slap, the threats, and the way he treated me like garbage just days ago. I told him, Daniel, we haven't been happy for years. You checked out a long time ago, and so did I. We're just holding on to something that doesn't exist anymore. He just stared at me for a minute, like he couldn't believe I was rejecting him. Then he says, Fine, I'll move out, but don't expect me to go easy on you in the divorce. And that was the end of that conversation. As if things couldn't get worse, our kids started picking up on the tension. Owen, our oldest, came to me one day and asked if everything was okay. He's 12, but he's smart. He knows something's up, even if we hadn't told them anything yet. I tried my best to reassure him, telling him that sometimes parents just have problems, but it doesn't mean we love him or his brother any less. But Owen wasn't buying it. He asked me, Is Dad leaving us? That question hit me like a ton of bricks because how do you even answer that? I didn't want to lie to him, but I also didn't want to give him the whole truth just yet. So I told him, Dad's going to be moving out for a while, but you'll still see him. He loves you both very much. Owen just nodded and didn't say anything else, but I could tell he was upset. He walked away, and I just stood there, feeling like I'd failed. I'd failed as a wife, and now I felt like I was failing as a mom too. All I wanted was for my boys to be okay, but this whole mess was affecting them more than I realized. Then, Logan, our youngest, came up to me later that night and he was crying. He asked, Is it my fault? Did I do something wrong? Is that why Dad's leaving? That just broke me. I sat him down and tried to explain that it wasn't his fault at all, that this had nothing to do with him or Owen. But how do you convince a kid of that when everything around him is falling apart? The next day, Daniel had a full-on meltdown. He comes home from work, slams the door, and starts ranting about how his new relationship with Alyssa is already falling apart. Apparently, she was mad because he wasn't committing fast enough, and she wanted to know if they were going to move in together soon. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This man had just left his wife of 10 years, and now he's surprised that his 25-year-old girlfriend wants more? I told him straight up, this is what happens when you try to live a life you're not ready for. You should have thought about that before you dragged our family through the mud. He didn't like that. At all. He started yelling, accusing me of being bitter and jealous. He said that I was the reason his life was falling apart, that if I'd been more understanding, maybe none of this would have happened. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. You're blaming me? You left me, remember? You were the one who wanted out, who found someone new. Now that it's not working out, it's suddenly my fault? He didn't have an answer for that. Instead, he just stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him like a teenager who didn't get his way. And I realized in that moment that I was completely done. There was no going back, no reconciliation, no working it out. This was the end, and honestly, I was okay with it. That night, I made up my mind. I was going to find a new place for me and the boys, and I was going to file for divorce as soon as possible. I didn't care what Daniel did or didn't do anymore. I just needed to protect myself and my kids from his toxic behavior. It was clear he wasn't going to change, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what else he was capable of. So I started making calls, looking for an apartment, and getting everything in order to finally put this chapter of my life behind me. And honestly, it felt good. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I felt like I was in control of my own life again. Update 1. So after I made the decision to get out of this mess and start looking for a new place, things got even more complicated, especially with Daniel's behavior becoming more unpredictable. It was like he couldn't decide if he wanted to be the villain or the victim, and honestly, it was exhausting. Every day was a different mood. Some days he acted like I didn't exist, and other days he'd try to guilt-trip me about the divorce, the kids, everything. But let me tell you about the day that really changed everything. One afternoon, I'm picking up the kids from school, and Owen's phone starts buzzing like crazy. At first, I didn't think much of it. He's 12. His friends text him all the time. But then I hear him go, "Why is Dad calling me? He never calls me during the day." Now that got my attention. Daniel had been pretty distant with the boys ever since all this started, so him suddenly calling during school hours was weird. I tell Owen to answer, and all I hear is this loud, panicked voice on the other end. Daniel's yelling something about how Alyssa had left him, how he didn't know what to do. I couldn't make out everything, but I caught bits and pieces like, "She's gone! And what am I supposed to do now?" Owen just stared at me with wide eyes, completely unsure of how to handle it, so I grabbed the phone and asked Daniel what was going on. Turns out Alyssa had packed up and left him. No warning, no note, nothing. Just gone. Apparently, she had gotten fed up with him not committing fast enough, and when she realized he wasn't going to move in with her anytime soon, she bailed. Honestly, I wasn't surprised. I mean, what did he expect? She's 25 and clearly wasn't about to wait around for a guy who was still tied up in a messy divorce. But the fact that he called Owen first, that was a new low. Like, why would you drag our kid into this? I told Daniel, look, I don't know why you're calling him about this. It's not Owen's responsibility to deal with your relationship problems. He didn't like that, obviously. He just kept going on about how Alyssa was the best thing that happened to him, how he didn't know how to handle it, and how I wouldn't understand. Yeah, I wouldn't understand being left. The irony was wild. After that phone call, Daniel went full victim mode. He started acting all pitiful around the house, moping like a teenager who just got dumped for the first time. But the worst part? He started trying to use the boys to get sympathy from me. I don't know if he thought I'd magically forgive him because he was sad, but it wasn't working. I was done, and nothing was going to change that. One night, after putting the boys to bed, Daniel sat down across from me at the dining table and started with, "I'm really struggling, you know?" I could tell where this was going, but I just let him talk. He went on about how hard things had been since Alyssa left, how he was trying to make sense of everything. And then he hit me with this. Maybe we could try again for the boys. For the boys. Of course, he brought them into it. I couldn't believe it. It was like he forgot everything that had happened between us, like the slap, the threats, the fact that he was the one who decided to leave me in the first place. I stared at him for a second, just trying to process how he thought this was going to work. "No, Daniel," I said. "We're not getting back together. You made your choice, and we're sticking to it. This isn't about the boys. It's about you trying to fix something that's broken beyond repair." He didn't take that well. He slammed his fist on the table and got up, pacing around the room. "So what? You're just going to throw everything away? We've got a family, for God's sake." "I'm not throwing anything away. You did that when you decided to leave for someone else," I said, trying to keep my voice calm even though I was boiling inside. "This is the consequence of your actions, not mine." He stormed out of the room after that, but the damage was done. I knew he wasn't going to stop trying to manipulate the situation, and I had to protect myself and the boys from his chaos. The breaking point came a few days later. I had been trying to keep everything as normal as possible for the kids. School, dinner, bedtime routines, all that. But Daniel was becoming more erratic by the day. He wasn't showing up for the boys like he used to, always making excuses for why he couldn't take them to soccer practice or help with homework. And when he was around, it was like walking on eggshells. The tension in the house was unbearable. One night, Owen came to me and asked, "Why does Dad seem so mad all the time?" That question broke me. I didn't want my kids to feel the weight of our problems, but it was clear they were noticing everything. I tried to explain it in a way that a 12-year-old could understand, telling him that sometimes grown-ups go through tough times, and it wasn't his fault. But Owen's smart. He knew more than he let on. A couple of days later, Daniel was supposed to pick the boys up from school, but he didn't show. No call, no text, nothing. I ended up leaving work early to grab them, and when I got home, Daniel was just sitting on the couch, staring at the TV like nothing had happened. I asked him why he didn't pick up the kids, and he just shrugged. Shrugged. I lost it. "Are you serious, Daniel? You didn't even have the decency to call? The boys were waiting for you." He barely looked up from the TV and said, "I forgot. It's not a big deal." Not a big deal. That was it. I couldn't handle it anymore. I realized then that I wasn't just done with the marriage. I was done with him as a person. This wasn't the man I married, and there was no going back from here. That night, after the boys were in bed, I made a decision. I was done waiting for him to figure his life out. I'd already found an apartment, and it was going to be available in a couple of weeks. I didn't care if Daniel tried to make things harder for me. I was going to get out, with or without his cooperation. I started packing the things I needed, slowly at first, just the essentials. I didn't want to tip him off too early, but I knew the moment was coming where I'd have to tell him I was leaving, and I had to be ready. The hardest part was knowing I'd have to break the news to the boys. I didn't want them to feel like I was taking them away from their dad, but staying in that house wasn't healthy for anyone. So I started preparing for that conversation too, trying to figure out how to explain it without making Daniel the bad guy. Even though he was the bad guy in this situation, I didn't want the boys to hate him. They needed to love their dad, even if he was making a mess of everything. But one thing was for sure. I was getting out. I wasn't waiting for another slap, another threat, or another guilt trip. This was the beginning of the end, and I was ready for it. Update 2. After making the decision to leave and finding a new place, I had a bit of a plan going. But of course, Daniel wasn't making things easy. I knew he'd flip when I told him I was moving out with the kids, but I had no idea just how bad things were going to get. So, I waited until the apartment was ready to go before bringing it up. I figured it'd be better to have everything set in stone so he couldn't try and sabotage my plans. I sat him down one evening after the boys had gone to bed. I wanted to make it as civil as possible, like no drama, no yelling, just an adult conversation. But let's be real, that's not how things work with Daniel anymore. I started with, "Daniel, I found a place. The kids and I are moving out in 2 weeks." Straight to the point, no beating around the bush. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me like I'd just told him I was taking the kids to Mars or something. Then he stood up, paced around the room a bit, and finally blurted out, "You're not taking my kids away from me." Now, mind you, this is the same guy who couldn't even be bothered to pick them up from school half the time. But now, suddenly, they're his kids, and I'm the villain for trying to leave a situation that's been toxic for months. I tried to keep calm, though. I told him, "Daniel, I'm not taking them away from you. You'll still see them. But this environment isn't good for any of us anymore." He didn't want to hear it. He started accusing me of brainwashing the boys, turning them against him. And that's when things started getting heated. He was pacing back and forth, raising his voice, throwing every accusation he could think of at me. He even brought up that stupid text again, the one I accidentally sent him instead of Mark. Like, dude, really? We're still on that? At some point, I realized talking to him was like talking to a wall. He wasn't interested in actually having a conversation. He just wanted to make me feel guilty for moving on, so I stopped responding and just let him vent. He stormed out of the house after that, slamming the door behind him. I knew that was just the beginning of what he was going to do next. Over the next few days, things got ugly. Daniel started throwing legal threats at me, saying he was going to fight me for full custody. He even told the boys that I was taking them away from their dad, which, of course, confused and upset them. I had to sit Owen and Logan down and explain that I wasn't taking them away, that they would still see their dad. But we just couldn't all live together anymore. Owen, being the older one, tried to put on a brave face, but I could tell he was struggling. He asked, "Does Dad hate you now?" And I didn't even know how to answer that. It sure felt like Daniel hated me, but I couldn't tell the boys that. Instead, I told him, "No, your dad and I just have different ideas about what's best for the family right now." It was the best I could do without making it sound like their dad was losing it. Meanwhile, Logan was having a harder time. He's always been more sensitive, and the idea of leaving the only home he's ever known was freaking him out. He asked me, "If we move, will Dad come too?" That one hit hard. I had to explain again that Dad would still be around, just not living with us. And I could see the confusion on his face. This was the part I dreaded the most, the impact it was having on the kids. 2 weeks later, I finally moved into the new apartment with the boys. It wasn't huge, but it was ours, and that was all that mattered. The first night there, after putting the boys to bed, I sat down in the empty living room and just breathed. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't have to deal with Daniel's constant mood swings or the tension that had been hanging over the house like a storm cloud. It was quiet, and that quiet felt like freedom. Of course, that peace didn't last long. The next morning, I got a call from Daniel. He was completely losing it on the phone, telling me I had ruined everything, and that the boys were going to hate me for breaking up the family. I just listened, letting him rant, but what came next caught me off guard. "I'm bringing Alyssa back," he said. "She's going to move in, and the boys will see what a real family looks like." I almost dropped the phone. Alyssa, the girl who left him because he wouldn't commit, was somehow back in the picture now? I didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the absurdity of it. I told him, "Daniel, you can't just bring someone into the boys' lives like that. They're already going through enough." But he didn't care. In his mind, this was his way of fixing things. He thought that bringing Alyssa back would somehow make him look like the good guy, like he was rebuilding the family, even though it was all a complete mess. I hung up, knowing that this wasn't the last time I'd have to deal with his nonsense. A couple of days later, the boys went to spend the weekend with Daniel, and sure enough, Alyssa was there. When they came back, Owen was quiet, and Logan seemed confused. Owen, being older, understood what was happening, and he didn't like it. He told me, "Dad's trying too hard. He acts like everything's fine, but it's not." Logan, on the other hand, was more innocent about it. He asked, Is Alyssa going to be our new mom? That question hit me like a punch to the gut, but I kept my cool. I told him, no, sweetie, you only have one mom. Alyssa is just Dad's friend. But I knew that wasn't enough. Daniel was pushing Alyssa into their lives way too fast, trying to replace me, and it wasn't fair to the boys. I could see it in their eyes. They were confused, hurt, and unsure of what was happening. And I hated that they were stuck in the middle of all this. The final straw came a few weeks later. Daniel called me, again ranting about something, and then he said, I'm going to fight you for full custody. The boys deserve to be with me. You're unstable. Unstable. He called me unstable. The man who couldn't keep his relationship with a 25-year-old together, who couldn't pick his kids up from school, and who slapped me during an argument, was calling me unstable. That's when I knew I had to fight back. I couldn't let him drag me through the mud and confuse the boys any longer. I called my lawyer that night and told him to prepare for the worst, because Daniel was clearly not going to play fair. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting the boys from the chaos their father was creating. And if that meant going to court and fighting tooth and nail, then so be it. I wasn't going to let him mess up their lives just because he couldn't handle his own. That's when everything changed. Update 3. Things got pretty wild after Daniel dropped that I'm going for full custody bomb on me. I knew he wasn't going to make this easy, but I didn't expect him to go that far. It was like everything was a game to him. 1 minute, he's begging for us to get back together, and the next, he's threatening to take the boys away from me. Honestly, at that point, I was just exhausted, but I couldn't let him win. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was about protecting the boys from the mess he was creating. So I did what I had to do. I lawyered up. I'd already been talking to my lawyer, but now it was time to get serious. I wasn't going to let Daniel spin this situation into some fantasy where he's the perfect dad and I'm the unstable ex-wife. I knew the truth, and more importantly, the boys knew the truth. We filed for a formal custody agreement, and as expected, Daniel didn't take it well. He went ballistic when he got the paperwork. I'll never forget the phone call that followed. He was yelling, accusing me of trying to destroy his relationship with the boys. I just sat there on the other end of the line, letting him ramble on about how unfair I was being, how he was going to make sure I paid for this. It was honestly hard to keep my cool, but I knew I couldn't engage with him. That's what he wanted, a reaction. I calmly told him, Daniel, this isn't about you and me anymore. It's about the kids. They need stability, and that's what I'm fighting for. He hung up on me. Fast forward a few weeks, and we're in court for the first custody hearing. I was a nervous wreck. I knew I had all my ducks in a row. Proof of Daniel's erratic behavior, the missed school pickups, his introduction of Alyssa way too soon. But that didn't stop me from feeling like my entire life was on the line. I remember walking into the courtroom trying to keep it together for the boys. They weren't there, thankfully, but the idea of them possibly having to choose between their parents weighed heavy on me. Daniel, on the other hand, walked in looking smug as ever, like he really thought he had this in the bag. I couldn't help but feel angry seeing him like that. After everything he'd put us through, he still thought he was in control. The hearing itself was a roller. Okay, it was intense. Both of our lawyers went back and forth, but the real kicker came when Daniel's lawyer tried to paint me as this unstable, bitter ex. He even brought up that damn text message again, the one I accidentally sent to Daniel instead of Mark. They tried to twist it into me being cold and heartless, like I didn't care about the marriage ending. But my lawyer shut that down quick. She brought up the slap, the missed school pickups, and Daniel's emotional manipulation, especially with the boys. She even had texts from Owen that showed how confused and hurt he was by Daniel's behavior. It wasn't just about me anymore, it was about what was best for the kids. After hours of back and forth, the judge finally made a decision. And I'll never forget the relief I felt when I heard her say that I would get primary custody of the boys. Daniel would get visitation, but it would be supervised at first, considering everything that had happened. It wasn't a complete win, but it was a huge weight off my shoulders. I could breathe again, knowing that the boys wouldn't be caught in the middle of Daniel's chaos. I wouldn't have to worry about them being used as pawns in his twisted game anymore. Of course, Daniel didn't take the decision well. He stormed out of the courtroom like a toddler having a tantrum, mumbling about how unfair everything was. I didn't even look at him. I didn't need to. I was done giving him any more of my energy, but the drama didn't end there. Later that night, he called me, and at first, I thought he was going to scream and yell like usual, but instead he was crying. Full on sobbing into the phone about how he couldn't believe this was happening, how he never thought things would end like this. I won't lie. There was a small part of me that felt sorry for him. I mean, this was the man I'd spent 15 years of my life with, the father of my kids. But that sympathy didn't last long. He had made his choices, and now he was facing the consequences. I told him, Daniel, This is what happens when you don't take responsibility for your actions. You're still their dad, but you need to get your life together if you want to be in their lives. He hung up on me again. In the weeks that followed, things started to calm down a bit. The boys were adjusting to our new routine, and I was doing my best to give them a sense of normalcy. Owen was still pretty quiet about everything, but he seemed relieved that the worst was over. Logan, on the other hand, was starting to bounce back to his old self. He'd always been more carefree, and I could see him relaxing now that we weren't living in constant tension. Daniel, surprisingly, started showing up for his supervised visits. I wasn't sure what his angle was at first, whether he was genuinely trying to make things right or if he was just trying to save face. But as time went on, he seemed to be making an effort, at least when it came to the boys. I wasn't ready to forgive him for everything, though. He still had a lot to prove. And to be honest, I didn't trust him enough to let my guard down. I wasn't going to let him drag us back into his mess again. A couple of months after the custody battle, I got a letter from Daniel. It was long, full of apologies, explanations, and promises that he was working on himself. He admitted that he had been wrong about a lot of things, leaving for Alyssa, trying to force a relationship with the boys before they were ready, and most importantly, how he treated me. Reading that letter, I felt a mix of emotions. Part of me was angry that it took him so long to realize what he'd done, but another part of me was relieved. Relieved that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to understand the damage he'd caused. I didn't respond to the letter. I wasn't ready to open that door again, and honestly, I didn't need to. I had moved on. The boys and I were building a new life, and I wasn't going to let the past drag me down. Now, months later, things are finally starting to feel normal again. The boys are thriving, we've settled into our new routine, and I'm focusing on my future. Daniel is still in the picture, but in a much smaller way. He's trying, I'll give him that, but it's going to take time for him to earn back the trust he lost. As for me, I'm just glad to be free. Free from the chaos, the manipulation, and the constant back and forth. It hasn't been easy, but I'm stronger now. And no matter what happens next, I know that I've got the boys, and we're going to be okay. That's all that really matters.